My name's Melanie Abrahams. I'm a curator, a producer, a mentor, and a coach, and I've been working in the arts for 25 years, primarily in literature, but also in the ways that literature intersects naturally with other art forms. And a number of years ago, I set up and created a company called Renaissance One, which produces and drives and galvanizes literature, particularly large ensembles and groupings and clusters of poets and novelists, showing some of the kind of diasporas of African, Caribbean, Asian, and other global majority cultures, and also championing the way that global majority writers have transformed Britain. My connection with Leeds stems from the late 90s. It was actually part of my first kind of role in literature. So I knew Bernardine Evaristo from around 1995. And a couple of years later, when I was working at the Africa Centre as a programmer, was maybe looking to leave and be more independent, she introduced me to Kwame Dawes, who was then living in Carolina, but would come over to England, and his collection Progeny of Air had won the Forward Prize. And he was part of People Tree, both published by People Tree, but also their poetry editor, and doing a lot of work in and around Leeds in the UK, mentoring lots of artists. So I actually had, I think, one of my first meetings within literature in Leeds. I met the People Tree team, Hannah Bannister and Jeremy Pointing, and I was kind of introduced to the venues right from then and started arranging events for Kwame Dawes and later on many other individuals. And then more recently, I've been doing a lot of mentoring there as well as live events. And I've also had a strong link with the David Oluwale Memorial Association as one of their both consultants and also co-producers. And I've been working on events that bring forward the aspects of mental health and lived experience and the ways that it not only seeps into literature and is part of that kind of ecosystem, but also the ways that mental well-being can be encouraged through literature and through dynamic aspects to poetry and creating art. And the other thing is, as well, is I'm friends of Mari Swanston Jeffers, who's a rising star in the Leeds scene as a dancer, a theatre maker, and a writer. And together, because we're both British Caribbeans, we set up the Rise Up Festival, which was a one-day Caribbean festival at Leeds Playhouse earlier in 2024, a lovely family-friendly event that gave occasions for performance, for celebrating our cultures and for liming. And I'd say that we're all kind of diaspora children. And so although I'm not based in Leeds and I'm currently based in London, I tend to do a lot of work where I feel the energy, where I feel the kind of diaspora connections. And Leeds is definitely one of those places in terms of the strong Leeds Caribbean community and also the way that they explore and harness their creativity, both inside Leeds and elsewhere. So I'm really happy to be working there. The aspect of mental health, the Black experience, and the arts is they're all kind of part of the same aspect. They're all part of the aspect of our living histories, of our traumas, but also the way that we can also move and progress towards mental well-being despite adversity. I like to think of it in terms of you can be something because of your experience and because of your trauma, but you can also become and create something in spite of your trauma and your experience. I'm not suggesting that that's an easy path, but I think that one of the things that we can do, whether we call ourselves Caribbeans or part of the diaspora or Black or global majority, we often have different kind of kinships and connections, and we all kind of describe ourselves different ways. But one of the things that's happened is there's been terrible inequity, particularly within the kind of mental health system, towards people of South Asian background and towards people of African and Caribbean background. It's definitely well documented. And one of the things that happened to me is I was studying at Bristol University, but I was a big kind of reader, and I was also trying to kind of navigate the aspect of Bristol not having the kind of diversity I would expect for a city that has such a strong colonial past, and you know, was one of the kind of key points for the kind of British Empire. And I was, I think, having difficulties and possibly, you know, mental health issues. But one of the things I was doing was I was studying and researching mental health, and I was actually doing my first dissertation for my degree on the mental health system. I was looking at Foucault, but I was also looking at global majority psychiatrists such as Dr. Suman Fernando. This was in the sort of this was in the 90s actually. And I was exploring the aspect of schizophrenia and the kind of misdiagnosis and the overrepresentation, particularly of men of African and Caribbean origin in the mental health system. And that actually became part of my dissertation, even though I was doing a politics degree. And my lecturers were slightly kind of perplexed by the specificity of what I was doing, because they didn't really realize that I was of Caribbean heritage. It just seemed like a very obscure kind of subject, but actually it was part of my kind of lived experience. Some of the things I was experiencing as someone of Caribbean origin who was kind of seeing aspects of sometimes a lack of well-being, both within my family and within my kind of different communities. And I was trying to understand why people of African, Caribbean and other origins were being so adversely affected, and why the system was so unequal, and why they were kind of being diagnosed so disproportionately. So this kind of degree became a way in which, you know, I kind of investigated. And I think more recently, having done that degree and having kind of done voluntary work and other kind of things, I'm doing it much more creatively now. So in recent years, prior to Jean Bintabree's passing away, we worked together on programs which fostered kind of mental health and well-being and poetry and kind of using voice for change. And we worked on a project called Showcase Smoothie in Leicester, which was a groundbreaking project done with the Bright Sparks kind of agency and organisation there, as well as the NHS. And every day it kind of helped and supported a whole range of different practitioners within Leicestershire in very meaningful ways. So I like to think now that some of that kind of research, some of that anxiety, and maybe some of the kind of ill health I was experiencing at the time has been progressed into something kind of a bit more meaningful, where I'm kind of navigating my way and being a bit more positive and progressive about the way I approach things. The reason that I think that poetry is important to the Black and Brown space is it's part of the lived experience and part of the heritage and culture of the Black and Brown space. So it's one of the things through which we live, through one of the things through which we do, and one of the things through which we foster and sometimes explore and sometimes commune with each other. Because poetry spaces, even when you're kind of alone and you're kind of working on it, there can be a sense even then of creating a kind of call and response with, you know, your kind of ancestors or with whomever you might be communicating or kind of exploring an idea with, or someone or a poet or someone that you've heard that you might have been inspired by. So I think there's definitely a kind of call and response element to it. I think there's a magic and an alchemy to it, in that sometimes we might think that we don't like poetry, and then we'll hear something in the street or somewhere else, which is a poem, and it will strike us and it will move us and it will resonate with us. You know, I think it can kind of catch us unawares. I think also that some of us will know the kind of poets and the poems that we like, but I always think that there's always that element of surprise. For me, I really love the orality of it. I'm definitely not a poet, but I'd say that I maybe think poetically, and I like to explore and navigate poetry in through this idea of coming to terms with oneself and coming to terms with different meanings. And I think that's one of the reasons that I end up working with so many poets, because there's some kind of resonances between our kind of creative journeys, even though I'm not, you know, wanting or planning to kind of be like them. And I think that the orality that I use in my practice, which is more kind of speech making, also has a connection with poetry, in terms of there were the kind of bards of old, or the griots, who would use both speech and poetry to give an account of themselves or to give an account of a space or a world. as well as to place and mark history and culture and heritage. By saying things and by naming things, you mark your heritage and culture, particularly in spaces where it's taken away or ignored. And particularly in Leeds, I'd say, the wonderful poet Jason Allen Paysant, who, has deservedly got a range of awards in the last few years, has been really trying to kind of capture as well as imagine and explore both in kind of a performative way, but also in an embodied way, different forms of poetry that relate to lived experience and the Black experience in Leeds and elsewhere. There's Emily Zelbel Marshall, who's an academic but also a poet, and she's been exploring kind of this aspect of kind of hidden mixed race stories. And there's Khadija Ibrahim, who's a very loved local poet who for a number of decades has been exploring not just the lived experiences of her community, but also those of herself and kind of ancestors. There's Malika Booker, who's moved to Leeds. So that again suggests that if poets are moving to Leeds to kind of make home, that Leeds is an interesting place to kind of be in that kind of firmament. And Malika Booker, for again decades, has really kind of sought to not just explore poetry and also really foster this aspect of Caribbeanness, but she's also explored aspects that pertain to lived experience of women and to elders and to kind of intergenerational stories, and they're just a few that I could name. There are many more. There's Romy Smith, who's really fantastic and kind of fuses aspects of words, and again, Amari Swanston Jeffers himself is kind of forging his own path, So I think, there's something about poetry which is infinite and which kind of gives us possibilities for well-being, not just in the doing and the listening, but also in the kind of making and the exploring. In terms of the mental health space, well-being, and kind of creative progress, as well as this aspect of, we talk about equity. How can we achieve greater equity within the Leeds communities and in general within the UK? I think there are some wonderful individuals and organisations. Often they aren't necessarily within the mainstream, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, in that sometimes working from the so-called margins can give you an advantage point because you're not necessarily subject to corruption. You can potentially keep a sense of ethics, but also you can really be at the nub of where things need to go. You can react very quickly, and you can coalesce and kind of develop things. However, there's this aspect of burnout. There's this aspect of not being seen and being invisible and what that can do to you. And there's also the aspect of, things can be deliberately under-resourced to create inequity. So for me, the future needs to recognize the ecosystem, the full ecosystem of both independence and institutions, those so-called minor, and kind of map and recognize it and value it and harness all of the individuals and entities and institutions that are making progressive and good work, and kind of galvanize it a little bit more and make it work a bit more effectively, just create a better system. I think that's one thing. And then I think, we are in 2024, we are beginning through marketing and other things to acknowledge diversity, but I always think that we never really catch up. We never really go far enough. And we need to allow people to describe themselves rather than tell them who they are based on their visible look. Because these days, in a diverse world, it will be very difficult to work out where someone's from just by looking at them. So we need to be a bit more open and porous and realize that diversity is diverse, and therefore we need to actually see it as a subject, as an element of research, as an element of exploration, as anything else, rather than kind of think that we're immediate experts because we ourselves happen to be diverse. You know what I mean? It's like ever complex, but in a really thrilling and exciting way. And for me, I never rest on my laurels with regards to understanding both kind of the mental health space and also the diverse space. I'm kind of interested in it, but I also put the work in. And I think the other thing we need to do is we need to recognize that a number of people who have been doing this for a number of generations or decades also need to be looked after and cared for. So not just the elders, but the people that are kind of mid-career and things like that. Because again, people can achieve burnout and kind of drop off if there's maybe a focus more on initiatives for young people, which I think are really important. But I think there need to be intergenerational initiatives to foster well-being, to encourage progress, to resource, and to kind of acknowledge, So more recently, what's coming to the fore is the fact that menopause is completely undervalued, under-recognized, but also under-researched in terms of, and there's a whole range of older global majority women that have been really fostering and developing and galvanizing aspects of mental health spaces. And if we think about it, it was Black women that even invented the term self-care, So we need to now perhaps recognize that people can't just keep going on indefinitely without those kind of support structures and that kind of acknowledgement of what they need. And I'm talking as well from personal experience, where in the last few years, as much as I've had the energy to kind of wake up in the morning, I've also, not had the physicality of it because I'm getting older, and because I'm also in a menopause state. And I really want to do more. And I have lots of colleagues that would like to do more. And I have older veneered elders revered elders who would love to do more as well. So I just want us in a way to support each other more meaningfully and more intentionally so that we can all be better and stronger together.